This pawn advance immediately opens diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, contesting the center and preparing for rapid piece development. This is the Sicilian defense, an asymmetrical response to white's e4 that immediately creates an unbalanced pawn structure and fights for central control by challenging white's d4 square. This move initiates the most common and flexible response to the Sicilian defense, developing a knight towards the center and preparing to support a central pawn push like d4. This move, 2, d6, initiates the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to control the center with a pawn and prepare for nf6 and g6 or e6, developing a solid and flexible pawn structure. This central pawn thrust immediately challenges black's pawn formation, opening lines and aiming to gain a space advantage as is characteristic of the main lines of the Sicilian defense. Black captures the central pawn, embracing the open Sicilian structure where both sides will vie for central control and rapid piece development. This move develops a knight towards the center, challenging black's pawn on d6 and preparing for further piece activity in this open Sicilian variation. Developing the knight to f6 directly challenges white's central pawn on e4 and prepares to castle. Common themes in the open Sicilian: aiming for active piece play and a flexible pawn structure. This move, nc3, is a very standard and solid continuation in the open Sicilian, developing a piece to a central square and preparing to support the d-pawn or potentially advance it further. This move, a6, is a common prophylactic maneuver in the Sicilian defense, often preparing nc6 or b5 to gain queenside space and prevent white's potentially disruptive bc4 or nb5. This move into the Sicilian Najdorf variation develops a piece to a strong square, prepares for kingside castling, and pins the knight on f6, restricting black's immediate pawn advances. This move prepares to develop the queen's bishop and control the central squares, aiming to achieve a solid pawn structure while challenging white's central control. This move aggressively stakes a claim in the center and prepares to expand the kingside pawn structure, aiming to gain space and potentially launch an attack against black's kingside. This move enters a critical theoretical variation of the Sicilian defense where black immediately challenges white's strong central pawn and knight. This move is designed to prepare the development of the queen's bishop and connect the rooks, while also potentially targeting black's queen on b6 and reinforcing the d4 pawn. This move gambits the b2 pawn to gain an initiative and potentially disrupt white's development by forcing a response to the exposed queen. This move recaptures the pawn on b2, reinforcing white's queenside development and preventing black from gaining further material or disrupting white's pawn structure. This move is a direct attempt to exploit the exposed position of white's queen and potentially win material, but it neglects black's own king safety and development. This exchange removes black's actively placed queen and creates a doubled pawn for black, weakening their kingside pawn structure while also opening the g-file for white's rook. This recapture opens up the g-file for black's rook, but significantly damages the kingside pawn structure and weakens the king's safety. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control the light squares and potentially support a kingside attack while keeping the pawn structure on the queenside intact after black's aggressive pawn capture. This move prepares to expand on the kingside, aiming to create attacking chances by opening lines against white's monarch while also potentially defending against future kingside advances by white. Castling kingside secures the monarch and prepares to connect the rooks, an essential step in consolidating the position after black's aggressive queen sortie. This move develops the knight and prepares to castle kingside, while also reinforcing the d4 square and potentially eyeing the c4 outpost. This move tucks the king away from the potentially dangerous queenside pressure in the open c-file, preparing for potential pawn pushes or piece activity on the kingside. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting potential kingside play and preparing for further piece coordination. This move is a surprising retreat, aiming to reposition the knight to a more flexible square and potentially avoid tactical complications arising from black's aggressive queen placement and pawn structure. The move 14. QB4 aims to reposition the queen to a more active square where it can attack white's pawn structure and potentially create further threats. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, supporting the central pawn advance and preparing to challenge black's control of the queenside. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the center and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or a knight maneuver to the c6 square. This move initiates white's plan to seize central space and potentially create an outpost for the knight on circa 5, aiming to restrict black's queen and bishop development while opening lines for attack. This pawn push aims to challenge white's centralized d4 pawn and gain more space on the kingside, though it weakens the dark squares around black's king. This move prepares to control the b4 square and potentially expand on the queenside, while also anticipating black's likely move of 17, fxe4, which would open the f-file for white. Black's queen repositions to a4, potentially targeting the queenside and preparing to contest the a-file or exert pressure along the a2-8 diagonal. This move initiates a central pawn exchange to open lines and activate the knight for a more dynamic middle game battle. The move 18, qc6 aims to reposition the queen from the vulnerable a4 square, offering protection to the f5 pawn and preparing to potentially contest the c-file if white decides to push c5. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn breaks or attacks. This move redirects the queen to a more active square, eyeing white's kingside and preparing to potentially disrupt white's pawn structure or create counterplay along the c-file. This move captures the pawn on f5, aiming to open the e-file for white's rook and potentially create attacking chances against black's king while disrupting black's pawn structure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the d4 knight and potentially supporting a queenside pawn push while solidifying black's defensive structure against white's aggressive central pawn push. This move opens the f-file for white's rook and creates immediate pressure on black's vulnerable king, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure. This capture on e6 opens the f-file for your rook and prepares to challenge white's control over the center. This move activates the rook to the d-file, a critical open file, to contest control and potentially target black's king or create pressure on the d6 pawn. By capturing the knight on d4, black aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and open the d-file, potentially creating attacking chances against white's king. This move recaptures a piece, but more importantly, it contests the crucial d-file and opens lines for white's remaining pieces, aiming to exploit black's potentially weakened kingside structure. This move simplifies the position by exchanging queens, leading to a more strategic endgame where black aims to exploit white's potentially weak queenside pawn structure while white seeks to utilize their active pieces. This move liquidates material, simplifying into an endgame where white's active rook on the d-file and better pawn structure will be decisive advantages. This move prepares to challenge white's rook on the d-file and aims to centralize the knight, potentially creating tactical opportunities by attacking the f2 pawn or supporting a pawn advance. On the king side, this move repositions the rook to a more active file, preparing to contest control of the d-file and potentially support a pawn advance in the center. This move aims to contest the important c-file and develop the rook to a more active central position, potentially preparing to pressure white's d-pawn. This rook move prepares to challenge the open c-file and potentially support advances on the kingside or pressure black's d6 pawn, aiming to increase white's activity in a complex middle game. Black's king is currently vulnerable on the e-file, and this move begins the crucial process of centralizing the monarch to a safer square while also preparing for potential defensive maneuvers against white's kingside pressure. The king's move to g1 is a standard prophylactic maneuver in many openings, aiming to safeguard the king from potential checks along the g-file and also to potentially prepare a kingside pawn push or facilitate rook maneuvers. This move, by advancing the pawn on h4, aims to create space for the king and potentially prepare a kingside pawn storm. But it weakens the dark squares around the black king. The bishop is repositioned to d3 to eye the weak f6 pawn and prepare for potential kingside activity or defense of the central pawns. This move seeks to contest the d4 square and potentially create a passed pawn on the c-file, while also preventing white's rook from easily advancing to the c4 square. This exchange simplifies the position by trading material and opening the g-file for white's rook, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and potentially create passed pawns. This capture opens the f-file, allowing the rook to become active and potentially exert pressure on white's king or weak pawns. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to contest the open c-file and support a potential advance of the d-pawn. This recapture on f4 opens the g-file for white's rook, potentially creating attacking chances against black's king, while also giving white a material advantage. This move activates the rook on the open d-file, creating immediate threats to black's king and potentially winning material by attacking the pawn on d6. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to potentially disrupt white's control over the c-file and support black's central pawn majority. This move aims to create a passed pawn on circa 5, which will become a significant strategic advantage by forcing black's pieces to defend it and limiting their mobility. This move repositions the rook to a more active file and prepares to defend the kingside, aiming to consolidate material equality after white's queenside pawn advance. This move creates a vital escape square for the king, preventing potential future checks along the first rank and offering more flexibility for the rook. On h1, this active check utilizes the open file to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and forces the king to move, potentially opening lines for further attack. The king retreats to the safety of the g-file, a necessary repositioning to avoid immediate danger from the opposing rook and to prepare for potential king safety maneuvers in the ensuing rook endgame. This rook move leverages the open c-file and the discovered attack on the white king, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially exploit the weak kingside. This defensive maneuver repositions the rook to better cover the d3 pawn and prepare for potential counterplay on the third rank, while also safeguarding against the opposing rook's pressure along the c-file. This move seeks to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and activate the rook on the first rank to create mating threats or force further concessions from white. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or reinforce the defense of the weak pawns. This move aims to centralize the knight and prepare for pawn advances on the kingside to create counterplay. This move activates the knight, repositioning it to a more central square where it can support the defense of the weakened kingside and potentially participate in future attacks. The move 37, Rg1, forces the white knight back, as it cannot defend the f2 pawn and white would otherwise be in a desperate situation after the exchange on g1. Nd1 is a necessary defensive maneuver to prevent the rook from being captured by the queen on the first rank and to prepare to recapture on e5 or potentially redeploy the knight to a more active square. 38. Re1. Black finally achieves activation for the rook on the first rank, creating threats along the open e-file and potentially targeting white's king or material if white is not careful. This move repositions the rook to the c-file, activating it on an open file and preparing to support a potential pawn push or to exert pressure on black's king. This move advances the e-pawn, creating a passed pawn and opening up lines for the bishop and rook, while also restricting white's pieces and potentially preparing for a kingside pawn storm. This move prepares to double rooks on the d-file, increasing pressure on black's weakened pawn structure and potentially creating a passed pawn with the c-pawn. This move develops the queenside pawn to create space and potentially disrupt white's coordination, aiming to use the semi-open a-file for future pressure. This move brings the knight back to a more active square, centralizing it and preparing to potentially support a future pawn push or assist in defending the kingside. This move is a critical pawn break in a complex Sicilian dragon reversed, aiming to exploit the open e-file and potentially create a passed pawn. But it also weakens the king's position and requires careful calculation to avoid tactical pitfalls. This move captures the pawn on h4, forcing black's rook to move and potentially opening the h-file for white's rook to exert pressure on the weakened black king. This move is a tactical blunder that allows white to promote a pawn with decisive advantage after the forced sequence. This check forces the black king into a more exposed position, creating opportunities for white to further advance its passed pawn or exploit the weakened king. Safety. Black's king is now exposed after 42. Exf2 and the white rook on h7 is delivering a check, forcing the king to move to a more vulnerable square, further complicating black's already precarious defensive situation. This check forces the black king to a more exposed position, simplifying the material and leading towards a favorable endgame for white given the king's awkward placement. This move seeks to defend the king by moving it to a safer square, avoiding the immediate checks and potentially preparing to connect the rooks.